A yellow taxi sped through the dark streets of New York City, its tires splashing through puddles under the flickering streetlights. Inside, Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the back seat, wearing a wrinkled black t-shirt and faded jeans. After a 16-hour flight, exhaustion lined his face as he watched the meter climb at an unusually fast rate. The driver, Mike Whitlock, kept glancing at his passenger through the rearview mirror, sizing up the tired traveler who seemed oblivious to the rapidly increasing fare. What happened in the next 30 minutes would change Mike's life forever, though he didn't know it yet. The events that unfolded would spread across social media, make headlines in New York papers, and teach a lesson about honesty that would impact thousands. As the taxi weaved through Manhattan's busy streets, neither man realized they were about to become part of a story that would showcase the true character of one of Hollywood's most beloved actors and transform a cynical taxi driver's entire worldview. But before we reveal what happened that rainy night, it's worth noting that this wasn't just about an overcharged fare. It was about something far more valuable than money. The choices made in that taxi would ripple out to touch countless lives, starting with one simple ride that was about to go very wrong. The torrential rain hammered against the windows of JFK's Terminal 4, creating a gray curtain that blurred the lights of waiting taxis into soft halos. It was past midnight, that peculiar hour when New York's usual chaos mellowed into something more subdued. The taxi stand stretched into the darkness, yellow cabs lined up like patient sentinels under the fluorescent terminal lights. Mike Whitlock sat behind the wheel of his taxi, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. 15 years of driving through New York streets had left him hardened, cynical about the countless faces that passed through his back seat. The night shift was usually good for business. Tired travelers were less likely to question routes or fares. Tonight's weather would only add to that advantage. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Mike watched a man approach his taxi. The stranger moved quietly, head slightly down, carrying just a small backpack. His dark jeans were wrinkled from travel, his black t-shirt looked worn, and his hair was slightly disheveled. To Mike, he looked like just another budget traveler trying to save money by taking a late-night flight. The terminal's harsh lighting cast shadows across Keanu's face as he reached for the taxi door. 16 hours of filming in Japan had left him exhausted, wanting nothing more than to reach his hotel and sleep. He declined the studio's offer of a private car, preferring the simplicity of taking a taxi like anyone else. His worn boots splashed through a puddle as he opened the door, bringing with him the smell of rain and the quiet dignity that always seemed to surround him. Inside the taxi, the air felt thick with humidity from passengers coming and going all night. The meter's red numbers glowed in the darkness, waiting to start their upward climb. Mike adjusted his rear-view mirror, catching glimpses of his passenger settling into the worn leather seat. The contrast between the simple man in his back seat and the luxury hotels of Manhattan created a familiar scenario in Mike's mind. Another tourist who'd probably complain about New York prices tomorrow. If only Mike had known who sat behind him, perhaps things would have gone differently. But in that moment, all he saw was an opportunity, not understanding that this ride would become a turning point in his life, a story that would spread far beyond the confines of his yellow taxi. The taxi pulled away from the terminal, windshield wipers fighting against the relentless rain. Mike cleared his throat, asking for the destination without turning around. Keanu's quiet voice replied with his hotel's address in Midtown Manhattan. Mike nodded, already calculating in his mind how he could stretch this fare. Traffic moved slowly through the wet streets, brake lights reflecting off puddles like scattered rubies. Mike took the Van Wyck Expressway, though he knew the Grand Central Parkway would have been faster at this hour. He watched the meter tick upward with each passing minute, adding silent dollars to what should have been a standard fare. Inside the cab, Keanu noticed the unnecessary turns and longer route, but remained silent. Years of traveling had taught him to observe more than react. The radio played softly in the background, a late-night talk show discussing celebrity gossip, adding an ironic soundtrack to their journey. Mike started his usual routine of small talk, the kind designed to distract passengers from watching the route too closely. He complained about the weather, the traffic, the construction that conveniently explained why they couldn't take certain faster routes. Each word carefully chosen to justify the mounting fare. The meter continued its steady climb as Mike deliberately missed an exit that would have shortened their journey. He glanced in his mirror, expecting to see another distracted tourist staring at their phone. Instead, he found his passenger calmly watching the city pass by, those dark eyes taking in everything with quiet awareness. Something about the passenger's serene demeanor made Mike slightly uncomfortable. Most tourists would be asking questions by now, or at least showing signs of impatience. This one just sat there, radiating a kind of tranquility that seemed out of place in a New York taxi at midnight. The rain intensified as they crossed the Queensboro Bridge, Manhattan's skyline emerging through the downpour like a glowing mirage. Mike took another unnecessary detour, adding precious minutes to the fare. He'd done this hundreds of times before. Tourists rarely complained, and those who did usually gave up after his well-rehearsed explanations about traffic patterns and construction zones. But as the meter passed the point where it should have stopped, Mike felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping up his spine. The silence from the back seat wasn't the usual tired tourist silence. It felt different, weighted with something he couldn't quite identify. The passenger's calm presence seemed to fill the entire cab, making the small space feel somehow smaller. Mike tried another round of distracting conversation, mentioning famous buildings they passed, dropping hints about celebrities he claimed to have driven. His passenger responded politely but briefly, each word measured and thoughtful. There was something about his voice, something Mike should have recognized, but the possibility never crossed his mind. As they approached Midtown, Mike had successfully added an extra 20 minutes to what should have been a straightforward ride. The meter showed a fare well above the usual rate, and he prepared himself for the familiar routine of justifying the cost to another unsuspecting visitor. Yet somehow, as the hotel's illuminated entrance came into view, Mike felt an unexpected twinge of uncertainty. The quiet dignity of his passenger had begun to crack something in his carefully constructed routine. Little did Mike know, the next few minutes would shatter his entire world, turning a simple taxi ride into a moment that would follow him for the rest of his life. The taxi finally pulled up to the hotel entrance, the meter displaying a fare nearly double what it should have been. Rain drummed against the roof as Mike shifted in his seat, preparing for the moment of truth. He'd perfected this part over years of overcharging tourists. The quick announcement of the inflated fare, followed by a rapid explanation of traffic and weather conditions before any protests could form. The meter glowed accusingly in the darkness. $147.50 for what should have been, at most, an $85 ride. Mike cleared his throat, announcing the amount with practiced casualness. He waited for the usual reaction, surprise, confusion, maybe even anger. Instead, the silence from the back seat grew deeper. Through the rear-view mirror, Mike watched his passenger lean forward slightly, studying the meter with those unerringly calm eyes. The movement brought his face into the glow of a passing streetlight, and for a brief moment, something about his features tugged at Mike's memory. But the thought dissolved as quickly as it came. Keanu spoke softly, his voice carrying no anger, just a simple question that would begin to unravel everything. "Could you explain why this ride costs nearly twice the standard rate?" The question hung in the air, more powerful for its gentleness. Mike launched into his rehearsed explanation about traffic patterns, construction, and the late-hour surcharge, excuses that had worked countless times before. But as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow under his passenger's steady gaze. Keanu listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his calm demeanor making Mike increasingly uncomfortable. When Mike finished his explanation, Keanu pulled out his phone, displaying a map application that had tracked their entire route. The screen showed every unnecessary turn, every missed exit, every deliberate delay. Mike's throat went dry. In 15 years of driving, no passenger had ever so quietly dismantled his scheme. He watched in the mirror as Keanu zoomed in on their route, tracing the meandering path they'd taken through the city. The The silence in the cab grew heavier with each passing second. "It seems we took quite a scenic route," Keanu observed, his voice still maintaining that same gentle tone. "Would you like to reconsider the fare?" The question wasn't threatening. If anything, it offered Mike a chance at redemption. But pride and habit made him double down, insisting that every turn had been necessary. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows as Mike defended his actions with increasing desperation. He cited road work that didn't exist, traffic patterns that weren't real, regulations he'd invented on the spot. With each excuse, he could feel himself sinking deeper into a hole of his own making. Keanu remained silent throughout Mike's explanations, his presence growing more substantial with each passing moment. There was something about his composure that made Mike's usual confidence waver. Most tourists would have given up by now, paid the inflated fare just to end the confrontation. But this passenger seemed in no hurry, his patience only adding to Mike's mounting discomfort. Outside, hotel staff had begun to take notice of the taxi lingering at their entrance. A doorman stepped closer, umbrella in hand, curious about the extended conversation taking place inside the cab. The scene was drawing attention, exactly what Mike usually tried to avoid during his overcharging schemes. As Mike's excuses finally ran dry, he caught another glimpse of his passenger's face in the mirror. This time, the recognition that had been tugging at his consciousness finally broke through. But before he could process this realization, before he could backtrack or apologize, everything changed. A guest entering the hotel stopped suddenly, doing a double-take at the taxi's back window. The next few seconds would shatter Mike's carefully constructed world, transforming a simple act of dishonesty into a moment that would haunt him for years to come. The truth was about to emerge, and with it, a lesson about integrity that would reach far beyond this rainy night in Manhattan. "Oh my God, that's Keanu Reeves." The excited voice cut through the rain-muffled silence of the taxi. Mike froze, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the words registered in his mind. His eyes darted to the rear-view mirror, really seeing his passenger for the first time. The realization hit him like a physical force. The man he'd been trying to swindle for the past 40 minutes wasn't just any tired traveler. It was Keanu Reeves, one of Hollywood's most respected actors, known as much for his kindness and humility as for his films. Mike's stomach dropped as memories of countless headlines about Reeves's generosity flashed through his mind. A small crowd had begun to gather outside the hotel. The doorman who had been watching the situation unfold now stood straighter, recognition dawning on his face. Through the taxi's windows, people were pointing, phones appearing in hands, cameras flashing despite the rain. Inside the cab, time seemed to stand still. The meter's red numbers glowed accusingly in the darkness, a testament to Mike's dishonesty. Keanu hadn't moved, his expression remaining calm and composed despite the growing commotion outside. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same gentle tone it had maintained throughout the ride. "I think we both know this fare isn't right," Keanu said, meeting Mike's eyes in the mirror. "But this isn't about the money. It's about the choice you made tonight, a choice that affects more than just me." Mike's face burned with shame. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to find words, any words, to explain or justify his actions. But under Keanu's steady gaze, every excuse felt meaningless. The carefully constructed defenses he'd built over years of overcharging customers crumbled in the face of this quiet confrontation. I'm so sorry, Mr. Reeves," Mike stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it was you. I never would have." He trailed off, realizing how much worse these words made everything sound. "That's exactly the point," Keanu replied, leaning forward slightly. "Would it have made a difference if you had known who I was? Should it make a difference? Every person who sits in this taxi deserves the same respect, regardless of who they are." The truth of these words hit Mike like a physical blow. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, phones recording the scene through the rain-streaked windows. News would spread quickly. Social media was already lighting up with posts about Keanu Reeves confronting a dishonest taxi driver. Mike's world was collapsing around him. Years of small deceits and justified dishonesty crashed down in this single moment of clarity. He thought about all the passengers he'd overcharged, all the tourists he'd taken advantage of, each one a betrayal of trust that he'd dismissed as just part of the job. "I've been doing this for so long," Mike admitted, his voice cracking. "Taking longer routes, adding extra charges. I convinced myself it wasn't really hurting anyone. Rich tourists, business people on expense accounts. I told myself they could afford it." Keanu listened quietly, his presence filling the cab with an almost tangible sense of moral authority. When he responded, his words carried the weight of genuine understanding rather than judgment. "We all make choices every day that shape who we become. It's never too late to choose differently." The rain continued its steady rhythm against the taxi's roof, but inside, the atmosphere had transformed. What had begun as a confrontation over an inflated fare had become something much more profound. A moment of truth that would alter the course of Mike's life. "I don't know how to fix this," Mike said, genuine despair in his voice. The meter still displayed the inflated fare, a glowing reminder of his shame. "Starting now would be a good first step," Keanu suggested quietly. "What do you think the actual fare should be?" Mike's hands shook as he recalculated the proper fare, conscious of the growing crowd outside and the weight of his passenger's steady gaze. $82.50, he said finally, his voice barely audible. "That sounds more accurate," Keanu agreed. He reached for his wallet, but paused before taking out any money. "The question is, what happens after tonight? What happens with your next passenger?" These simple questions struck at the heart of everything. Mike sat in silence, confronting years of rationalized dishonesty. Outside, camera flashes continued to illuminate the rain, capturing a moment that would soon be shared across the world. But inside the taxi, a more important story was unfolding. The story of one man facing the truth about himself. Through the rain-streaked windows, dozens of phones recorded the scene as Keanu reached forward and placed exactly $82.50 on the center console. The simple action carried more weight than any words could have conveyed. Hotel security had emerged, preparing to manage the growing crowd. But Keanu raised his hand slightly, silently asking them to wait. "Everyone makes mistakes," Keanu said, his voice carrying that same gentle authority that had characterized the entire interaction. "What matters is what we learn from them." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "I could report this incident. The Taxi and Limousine Commission takes fare manipulation very seriously." Mike's heart pounded in his chest. A violation like this could cost him his license, destroying his only means of supporting his family. The reality of how close he was to losing everything crashed over him in waves. But Keanu wasn't finished speaking. "However, I think there's an opportunity here for something more valuable than punishment." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but compassionate. "You have a choice to make right now. Not about this fare, but about every fare that comes after. About the kind of person you want to be." Outside, the crowd had fallen silent, pressed against the windows, sensing they were witnessing something significant. The rain continued its steady drumming, creating a private atmosphere despite the public setting. Mike found himself unable to look away from his passenger's steady gaze in the mirror. "I've spent 15 years justifying what I do," Mike said, his voice rough with emotion. "Telling myself it was okay because everyone does it, because tourists expect it, because that's just how things work in New York." He swallowed hard. "But sitting here now, I can't remember why any of that seemed right." A small smile appeared on Keanu's face, not one of triumph, but of understanding. "That's because deep down you always knew it wasn't. We all know the difference between right and wrong. Sometimes we just need a reminder." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Mike thought about all the passengers who would never know they'd been cheated, all the trust he betrayed. Each small dishonesty had shaped him into someone he never meant to become. "I want to be better," Mike said quietly, surprising himself at the truth in those words. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Keanu nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card. "This belongs to a friend who runs a taxi company. They're known for their integrity. Tell him you spoke with me. He's always looking for drivers who understand the value of honest work." Mike took the card with trembling fingers, staring at it as if it were a lifeline. In many ways, it was... "Why?" he asked finally. "Why help me after what I tried to do?" "Because everyone deserves a chance to make things right," Keanu replied simply. "The question is, what will you do with that chance?" The moment was interrupted by a gentle tap on the window. The hotel manager had appeared, looking concerned about the growing crowd. Keanu gathered his small backpack, preparing to leave, but paused with his hand on the door handle. "Remember this feeling," he said softly. "Remember how it feels to choose integrity over easy money. That feeling is worth more than any extra fare you could ever collect." The words struck Mike with the force of revelation. In all his years of driving, no passenger had ever seen through him so completely or offered such a profound opportunity for redemption. Tears pricked at his eyes as he realized the gift he was being given. Not just forgiveness, but a chance to reclaim his self-respect. News of the incident spread across social media with lightning speed. Within hours, videos captured through the taxi windows had gone viral, sparking conversations about honesty, humility, and the power of second chances. Hashtag Taxi Transformation and hashtag Keanu Teaches Kindness became trending topics as thousands shared their own stories of encounters with dishonest taxi drivers. The hotel security footage, showing Keanu's calm handling of the situation, appeared on major news networks. Commentators praised his measured response, noting how he transformed a moment of confrontation into an opportunity for positive change. Stories emerged about his reputation for kindness, with the taxi incident becoming another chapter in the growing legend of Keanu Reeves' humanity. Mike's world changed dramatically in the hours following that rainy night. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow drivers, some supportive, others critical. The taxi company he worked for called an emergency meeting, concerned about their reputation in light of the viral videos. Instead of denying anything, Mike did something unexpected. He told the truth. In a room full of company executives, Mike detailed years of overcharging practices, not just his own, but an unofficial system many drivers participated in. His voice shook as he described how one passenger's quiet dignity had forced him to confront the person he'd become. The executive sat in stunned silence as Mike offered his resignation. But something extraordinary happened. The company president, moved by Mike's honesty, saw an opportunity. Instead of accepting his resignation, she proposed a different solution. Mike would help develop a new training program, focusing on ethical practices and customer trust. His experience would serve as a cautionary tale, but also as proof that change was possible. Social media continued to buzz with updates. When Mike's story emerged, how he was working to reform the system from within, public reaction transformed. What had started as criticism of one driver became a larger conversation about integrity in the service industry. People shared their own stories of choosing honesty over easy profit, inspired by the viral moment that had touched something universal in human experience. The card Keanu had given Mike led to several conversations with the other taxi company. They were interested not just in hiring him, but in having him share his story with their drivers. Mike found himself in the unexpected position of becoming an advocate for change in an industry he'd once exploited. Local news stations requested interviews, wanting to hear about the night that changed everything. Mike agreed to only one, choosing a small community station. In the interview, he spoke not about Keanu Reeves' celebrity, but about the lesson in human dignity he'd learned. His voice cracked as he described the moment he realized how far he'd strayed from his own values. It wasn't about the money, he explained to the interviewer. It was about who I'd chosen to become, one small decision at a time. Sometimes it takes someone showing you real integrity to make you see how far you've drifted from it. The ripple effects continued to spread. Other taxi companies in New York began reviewing their practices. Customer complaints about overcharging decreased as drivers, inspired by the viral story, reconsidered their own choices. What had started as one rainy night confrontation was evolving into a movement for change within the industry. 3 months after that fateful night, Mike Whitlock sat in a brightly lit classroom at the taxi training center. Instead of behind a wheel, he now stood before a group of new drivers, sharing his story. The room fell silent as he described his transformation from someone who saw passengers as opportunities for profit to someone who understood the true value of trust. "I used to think success in this job was measured by how much extra money I could make," he told the attentive faces before him. "Now I understand it's measured by the trust we build with every honest fare, every straightforward route, every sincere interaction." The training program he helped develop had become mandatory for all new drivers in the company. Mike worked closely with management to address the root causes that led drivers to choose dishonesty, the pressure to meet quotas, the competition from ride-sharing services, the struggle to make ends meet. Together, they created solutions that supported drivers while maintaining integrity. His personal life transformed as well. The weight of constant deception lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. His family noticed a change. He smiled more, shared stories about his day with pride rather than careful editing. His teenage daughter told him she was proud of how he'd handled the situation, words that meant more to him than any amount of extra fares. The business card Keanu had given him led to regular consulting work with other taxi companies. Mike became known as someone who could speak honestly about the pressures drivers face while advocating for ethical solutions. His story resonated because it wasn't about perfect behavior, but about the courage to change when confronted with the truth about oneself. One rainy evening, similar to that fateful night, Mike received a call from a driver struggling with the same temptations he'd once faced. They met at a small diner, and Mike listened as the young man described the justifications he'd begun making to himself. Mike recognized every rationalization, every excuse. They were the same ones he'd once used. "I know exactly where that road leads," Mike told him, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Each small dishonesty makes the next one easier, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize the person you've become. But there's always a choice to turn around." The changes Mike advocated weren't always easy. Some drivers resisted, clinging to old habits. But slowly, steadily, the culture began to shift. Customer satisfaction scores rose. Driver retention improved. The company's reputation for honesty became a selling point in a city often cynical about taxi services. During particularly challenging moments, Mike would replay that rainy night in his mind. He remembered the calm dignity with which Keanu had handled the situation, offering redemption instead of punishment. That memory became his touchstone, reminding him why the harder path of honesty was worth choosing every single day. As months passed, Mike's story became part of the company's orientation for new drivers, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that integrity wasn't just a noble ideal. It was a practical choice that led to sustainable success. The business card Keanu had given him, now framed in his office, served as a daily reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of truth. A year after the viral taxi incident, the changes in New York's taxi industry had become unmistakable. The training program Mike helped create had spread to multiple companies across the city. Industry statistics showed a significant decrease in fare-related complaints, while driver satisfaction scores reached new highs. The story continued to resonate because it touched something universal: the possibility of transformation. Business schools use it as a case study in ethical decision-making. Leadership seminars referenced it when discussing integrity in the workplace. What had started as one driver's moment of truth had grown into a broader conversation about honesty in service industries. Keanu's handling of the situation became its own lesson in leadership. Instead of public shaming or punishment, he had chosen to offer an opportunity for change. This approach inspired managers across various industries to reconsider how they handled ethical lapses within their organizations. Mike received an invitation to speak at a national transportation conference. Standing before industry leaders, he shared not just his story, but the practical results of choosing integrity over quick profits. Revenue had actually increased as customers, trusting the fare system, chose licensed taxis over alternatives. Driver retention improved as the stress of maintaining deceptions disappeared. The business card that had changed everything remained framed in Mike's office, but now it shared wall space with letters from drivers whose lives had been impacted by the program. One wrote about how his children's renewed pride in his work meant more than any extra fares ever had. Another described the relief of no longer having to maintain elaborate justifications for dishonest practices. Social media occasionally resurfaces the video from that rainy night, sparking fresh conversations about integrity and second chances. Each time, new comments appear from people inspired to make their own changes, proving that the impact of one honest moment could continue rippling outward indefinitely. Professional driver associations began including ethics training in their certification programs, acknowledging that technical skills alone weren't enough. Mike's story served as evidence that integrity wasn't just morally right, it was good business. The industry was slowly transforming from one often viewed with suspicion to one building trust with every honest fare. On a busy evening in Manhattan, Mike watched a new driver handle his first solo shift. The young man had just completed the ethics training program, and something in his confident, honest interactions with passengers reminded Mike of how far the industry had come. A customer approached the taxi stand, dressed in simple clothes, carrying a worn backpack. Mike observed as the new driver greeted him with genuine respect, confirmed the destination, and took the most direct route without hesitation. The scene brought him back to that rainy night that had changed everything. As the taxi pulled away, Mike remembered Keanu's words about the choice each person makes about who they want to become. The lesson hadn't just been about honest fares. It had been about the countless small decisions that shape character, the daily choices between easy profit and lasting integrity. The taxi industry in New York had transformed, not through regulations or penalties, but through one moment of truth that inspired others to reflect on their own choices. Mike's story continued to remind people that change was possible, that one honest interaction could spark a revolution in integrity. That night, as Mike headed home, he passed a hotel where everything had changed. The rain-slicked streets reflected the city lights, just as they had on that fateful evening. He thought about all the passengers who would never know they'd been part of a larger transformation, all the drivers who now chose honesty not because they had to, but because they understood its true value. In the end, the story of the taxi driver and the actor became more than just a viral moment. It became proof that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness aren't in forgiving mistakes, but in showing people a better way forward.